She called me the help. Not to my face, never to my face. She said it to her mother, low and quick, the way people talk when they think the old man in the corner can't hear anymore. But I've been getting up at 4 in the morning for 40 years. My hearing is just fine. I was standing near the kitchen doorway of my daughter's new house. The house my son-in-law's family had picked out, paid the down payment on, and never let anyone forget, holding a casserole dish my wife Betta made before she passed. Green bean casserole. Same recipe she made every Thanksgiving since 1987. I'd driven 3 hours to bring it. My daughter had asked me to come 2 weeks early to help set up for the welcome dinner. So there I was, apron over my flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, cutting board in front of me, and my son-in-law's mother, Claudette, looked at me and said to her daughter, "Is the help eating with us tonight or in the kitchen?" Her daughter, my son-in-law's sister, Noelle, laughed. Just a little, just enough. I set the knife down. I looked at the onion I was dicing. I picked the knife back up and kept cutting. That was 6 months before everything fell apart and came back together. And I learned that the thing about being underestimated your whole life is that people leave you alone long enough to actually get things done. My name is Roy Decker. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a pipe fitter in the Gulf Coast refineries, then another 12 running my own plumbing contracting business out of Beaumont, Texas. I own my house outright. I drive a 2019 F-250 that I bought used and maintain myself. I am not a complicated man. I cook my own meals, fix my own fences, and go to bed before 9 most nights. I do not own a suit. I own 2 sport coats, one brown, one navy, and I consider that more than sufficient. My daughter, Lee, is 34. She looks like her mother. That same way of tilting her head when she's deciding whether to trust you. She got her mother's patience too, which is more than I can say for myself. She met her husband, Tanner Aldridge III, at a conference in Houston. He's 37, works in private equity, wears shirts that cost more than my first truck payment. He's not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. Tanner is not a bad man. He just comes from people who have never once had to be good at anything other than appearing good at everything, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. His parents, Tanner Sr. and Claudette, live in River Oaks. That's the old money neighborhood in Houston, for those who don't know. The kind of neighborhood where the houses have names, not addresses, names. Theirs is called Aldridge Hall, and they did not name it ironically. I found this out at the first dinner we all had together, about 8 months before the wedding. Tanner Sr. mentioned it the way you mention what you had for breakfast. We had Lee out to Aldridge Hall last month, wonderful visit. I nodded. I said sounded nice. Claudette looked at my hands. People like her always look at your hands. Lee got engaged in February. By March, Claudette had taken over the wedding planning so completely that my daughter had to schedule calls with her to discuss the flowers at her own wedding. I watched this happen. I didn't say anything, because Lee asked me not to, and because I knew, in the way you know these things, after 6 decades of dealing with people, that picking that particular fight would cost my daughter more than it would cost me. But I noticed when the venue shifted from the place Lee had bookmarked for 2 years to the Aldridge family's preferred country club in River Oaks, 45 minutes farther from her friends. I noticed when the guest list grew from 120 to 240, mostly Aldridge connections, business associates, people Lee had never met. I noticed when Claudette casually mentioned that the rehearsal dinner would be more intimate, meaning just the Aldridge family, their close friends, and immediate wedding party, and somehow neglected to make clear that this apparently did not include me until Lee called me 3 days before, crying to explain. I told her it was fine. I told her I'd drive up the morning of the wedding and not to worry. I drove up the morning of the wedding. I wore the navy sport coat and the good boots I keep for church. I'd gotten a haircut. My barber Rodney told me I looked distinguished. I tipped him extra. The ceremony was at 2. I arrived at 11 because Lee had asked if I could come early to see her before the photographers showed up. When I walked into the bridal suite, she was sitting in a chair in her veil and robe, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. She looked up and something crossed her face that I hadn't seen since she was about 7 years old and had fallen off her bike and was trying very hard not to cry. She said, "Daddy?" I said, "Hey, sweetheart." And I sat down next to her and we talked for 45 minutes about her mother, about the drive down from Beaumont, about the green bean casserole I'd almost burned, about a dog we'd had when she was small named Biscuit, who used to sleep on the dryer because it was warm. We did not talk about the rehearsal dinner. We did not talk about Claudette. We talked about Biscuit and how he'd once eaten an entire pound cake off the kitchen counter and looked genuinely surprised that it made him sick. She walked down the aisle on my arm. That part was right. Whatever else had gone sideways, Lee and Tanner had held that line, and I was grateful. The reception was something else. I was seated at table 11. This is not the worst thing that has ever happened to me. I've had worse days than table 11. But I want you to understand the geography here. The Aldridges were at the head table with the wedding party. Their family friends occupied tables 1 through 4, business associates at 5 through 8. What the seating chart coordinator, a young woman named Paige, who seemed deeply stressed by her job, described to me as family, was tables 9 through 12. I was seated between a second cousin of Tanner's, who was attending law school in Austin, and Claudette's college roommate's husband, who had been recently divorced and wanted to talk about it. I had the chicken. It was fine. What happened during the reception is that I sat there, in my navy sport coat, watching my daughter dance with her new husband, and I made a decision. Not the kind of dramatic decision that happens in movies with music swelling and someone clenching their jaw. The quiet kind. The kind that just settles into you while you're eating chicken and listening to a recently divorced stranger talk about how the court system is biased against men. I decided I was done making myself small for people who had not earned the right to make me feel small. This decision did not produce immediate visible results. That's the thing about quiet decisions. They take time. 3 weeks after the wedding, Tanner Sr. called me. Not Tanner, not Lee. Tanner Sr. He had gotten my number from somewhere, I assume from Leigh, or possibly from Tanner, neither of whom mentioned the call to me beforehand. He was charming on the phone, the way powerful men are charming when they want something. He asked how I was settling in, after the wedding, how the drive back to Beaumont had been. He asked about my business, in the vague way people ask about things they don't actually want to hear about. Then he told me he'd been talking to some of his associates about a development project in the hill country. Some mixed-use residential and commercial property outside of Fredericksburg, and that they were looking for experienced contractors who knew how to keep a job site running on schedule. He asked if I'd be interested in coming up to Houston to hear about it. I said I'd think about it. I spent a week thinking about it. I talked to my accountant, a woman named Beverly. Excuse me, my former accountant, she moved to Fort Worth. No, a woman I'll call my financial advisor, which is close enough. I talked to my attorney, a man named Pete Colton, who has handled my legal affairs for 15 years and who I trust more than I trust most members of my own family. Pete told me to go hear the pitch. He said, "Roy, at minimum, you find out what they think you're worth to them. That's useful information." Pete is a smart man. I drove to Houston on a Tuesday. The Aldridge offices were on the 34th floor of a building in Greenway Plaza, all glass and views of the city. The kind of place where someone has clearly spent a lot of money making it look like they haven't tried very hard. Tanner Sr. met me in the lobby. He was wearing a suit that cost more than I make in a good month. He shook my hand and held it a half-second too long, which is something people do when they're trying to establish dominance. I noticed. I didn't react. The pitch was for a contracting partnership. They needed someone to run ground-level operations on the Fredericksburg project, coordinating crews, managing subcontractors, keeping the build timeline on track. In exchange, they were offering a project management fee plus a small equity stake in the development. The numbers they presented were real numbers, substantial numbers, not insulting. I listened to the whole presentation. Tanner Sr.'s business partner, a man named Clifford Hayes, did most of the talking. PowerPoint slides, architectural renderings, projected ROI, very polished. When they finished, Tanner Sr. asked me what I thought. I said, I'll want to see the site, talk to the subcontractors you've already contracted, and review the full partnership agreement with my attorney before I say yes to anything. Clifford Hayes blinked. I think he had expected me to shake hands right there in the conference room. I did not shake hands in the conference room. What I did over the following 3 weeks was exactly what I'd said. I drove to Fredericksburg. I walked the site. I asked every question I could think of, and some I'd borrowed from Pete. I had long phone calls with 2 of the subcontractors they'd already engaged, one of whom told me, off the record, that the project had been stalled for 4 months due to permitting issues that Tanner Sr.'s people had, in his words, handled poorly. I passed all of this back to Pete. Pete read the partnership agreement and made 13 revisions. Tanner Sr. accepted 11 of them after 2 rounds of back and forth. We went to contract. I told Lee about it the week before I signed. I drove up to Houston, and we had dinner, just the 2 of us, at a diner near her office that she'd mentioned liking. She listened to the whole thing with that head tilt of her mother's, and when I finished, she said, "Daddy, are you sure about this?" I said, "I'm not sure about anything, but Pete says the deal is solid, and I'll get to spend more time near you." She was quiet for a minute. She said, "Tanner's dad doesn't know what you're capable of, you know. He thinks he's doing you a favor." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you going to let him keep thinking that?" I looked at her. She was smiling, just slightly, the same way her mother used to smile when she already knew the answer and was waiting to see if I'd catch up. I said, "For now." Here is what Tanner Sr. did not know about me. I had been running crews since I was 28 years old. I had managed union and non-union labor, resolved jurisdictional disputes, negotiated with 3 different inspectors named Dave, and once kept a job site running through a Category 2 hurricane because the client's completion bond deadline was in 4 days, and we were 48 hours from done. I had never missed a project completion deadline, not once. In 31 years of contracting in the Gulf Coast, through 3 recessions, 2 hurricanes, and 1 global pandemic. What Tanner Sr. had in his 30 years of real estate development was money and connections. What he did not have was anyone on his team who actually knew how to run a job site. His last project manager had lasted 11 months, the one before that, 7. I lasted. I organized the subcontractor schedule in the first 2 weeks and identified 6 places where overlapping work orders had been creating delays. I restructured the permitting approach with the county, which required 3 meetings with a city planner named Roderick, who initially thought I was there to argue with him, and who later told me I was the most straightforward contractor he dealt with in 12 years. I brought the project back on timeline in 6 weeks. Clifford Hayes sent me an email that said, "And I am not exaggerating, I don't know how you did this, I know how I did this. I did this the way I've done everything in my life, which is by showing up and doing the work and not requiring anyone to applaud." Tanner Sr. started calling me directly. He started introducing me at site visits as his operations man, which I found both flattering and slightly irritating, the way a compliment can be. He started inviting me to dinners that were clearly more than dinners. Dinners where deals were being discussed, where hands were being shaken, where the people at the table were people who moved money in large quantities. He had revised his assessment of me, and he was letting me know it in the only language he really spoke, which was access. I went to some of these dinners. I wore the Navy sport coat. Claudette did not revise her assessment of me. This is worth noting. Claudette saw her husband's behavior toward me and responded by becoming, if anything, slightly more precisely cold. Not rude. Never rude. That was beneath her. But at a dinner in October, when Tanner Sr. was explaining something I'd accomplished on the Fredericksburg site to a table of his associates, I caught Claudette looking at me with an expression that I recognized. Because I had seen it before from people who cannot decide what category to put you in and are irritated by the ambiguity. She still did not know quite what to make of me. She was not sure I belonged at her table. She was even less sure that she could say so. I said nothing. I ate my dinner. I listened to Tanner Sr. tell a story about a land deal in 1998 that I had now heard twice. The situation with Lee was more complicated. My daughter is a strong person. She had built a life she was proud of, in a marriage she had chosen freely, and she was not someone who needed rescuing. I want to be clear about that, because I've seen how these stories go. The father riding in, declaring everything ruined, making it about himself. That was not what was happening, and that was not something I was going to do. Lee was happy. Tanner loved her. The problems were not in the marriage. The problems were in what surrounded the marriage, the constant low-grade pressure from Claudette to do things the Aldridge way. The weight of a family that had very specific expectations about how a daughter-in-law should present herself, what charities she should be on the boards of, where she should summer, how her house should look in the Christmas card. None of it was cruel. All of it was suffocating. I saw it when I had dinner with Lee in November. She was thinner. Not sick thin, just pressed thin. The kind of thin that comes from holding yourself very carefully for a long time. She laughed at all the right moments. She said everything was great. At the end of the night, she walked me to my truck and stood in the parking garage and said, "Daddy, do you ever feel like you've been very polite for so long that you've forgotten how to be yourself?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Yeah, I felt like that for about 6 months once. Then I stopped being polite." She said, "What happened?" I said, "People got mad, then they got over it, then things were better." She nodded slowly. She said, "I'm not ready yet." I said, "I know. You'll know when you are." The thing that finally broke open happened in December at the Aldridge's Christmas party. This is an event. Not a party in the casual sense, an event with a printed program and a hired string quartet and about 90 people moving through their River Oaks house in formal wear. I was invited this year, which was a change from the previous year when I had not been. Tanner had asked specifically that I be included. Lee had told me this afterward, not to make a point, just because she thought I should know. I wore the navy sport coat. Rodney had trimmed my beard. I drove up and parked on the street because the valley situation made me uncomfortable. I was in a room with Claudette and 3 of her friends when it happened. Pleasantly, I thought, with a woman named Patricia about her grandchildren, when Claudette said something to the woman next to her. She said it quietly, but the room had a lull in the noise at exactly the wrong moment, and I heard every word. She said, "He means well. He just doesn't quite fit, does he? Tanner does love Lee, but one does wonder what she brought with her." The woman next to her, I didn't know her name, made a small sympathetic sound. Patricia, the woman I'd been talking to, looked at me. She had heard it too. I smiled at Patricia. I excused myself. I walked across the room, got a glass of water from a passing server, and found Tanner. Tanner was talking to 2 of his father's colleagues. He saw my face and something shifted in his. He knew. Whatever it was, whatever expression I was wearing, he recognized it as significant. He said, "Roy, you all right?" I said, "I need about 5 minutes with you." We stepped into a hallway. I told him exactly what I'd heard, word for word, without editorializing. Tanner was quiet for a moment. He said, "Roy, I'm sorry. I said, "I don't want an apology from you. You didn't say it. I'm telling you because you need to know that your wife has been navigating this for over a year, and she is tired in a way that's going to have consequences if it doesn't change. I'm telling you because you're her husband, and this is your family, and it is not my place to fix it, but it needs to be fixed." He looked at me for a long moment. He's not a stupid man, Tanner. He's limited in some ways, but he's not stupid. He said, "You've known about this for a while." I said, "I've known since before the wedding." He said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "Because Lee asked me not to, and because it wasn't my fight. It's yours." He nodded. He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." We went back to the party. I stayed another hour, said my goodbyes, drove back to Beaumont in the dark. I listened to the radio most of the way home. I thought about Bet. I thought about how she always said that the hardest part of loving someone is knowing when to step back and when to step in. I thought I'd probably gotten the timing about right, or close enough. What happened after that, I know partly from Lee and partly from Tanner, who called me in January on a Sunday morning, which surprised me. He had talked to his mother. This conversation, by his account, had lasted 2 hours and covered ground that had not been covered in 37 years of his life. He had said things he had been afraid to say. Claudette had eventually listened. She had not agreed with everything, but she had listened. Tanner Sr. had also been in the room for part of this conversation, and apparently had said, in reference to me, something that he repeated to Tanner afterward. Roy Decker is the most competent person I've brought onto any project in 15 years. I should have treated him accordingly from the start. I heard this and I felt something settle in my chest. Not vindication, exactly. Something quieter. Something like being seen, which is different from being right. Claudette called Lee a few days after that. I don't know what was said in that conversation. Lee mentioned it once, briefly, saying only that it had been different. I didn't ask for details. That conversation belonged to them. What I know is that when we all had dinner together in February, Lee, Tanner Sr., Claudette, and me. Claudette asked me at some point during the meal to tell her about the Fredericksburg project, not politely, not with the gracious indifference she'd shown toward everything I'd said for the past year. Actually asked, made eye contact, waited for the answer. I told her about it. The permitting issues, the subcontractor scheduling, the conversation with Roderick, the city planner. She listened. She asked 2 intelligent questions. At the end she said, "You must be very good at what you do." I said, "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "Lay's lucky to have you." It was not an apology. I don't think Claudette is someone who apologizes directly. But it was the closest thing to one she knew how to offer, and I decided that was enough. Not because I didn't deserve the full version, but because I am 63 years old, and I have learned that holding out for the exact form of acknowledgement you think you deserve is a good way to spend the rest of your life waiting. Lee squeezed my hand under the table. I squeezed back. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station outside of Sealy and got a cup of coffee and stood by my truck for a while in the cold air. The highway was quiet. There's a particular kind of quiet that only exists at highway stops and gas stations at night, where you're between places, where nobody needs anything from you for just a few minutes. I stood in that quiet and I thought about Bet the way I always do. I thought about how she would have handled all of this differently and probably better, and also how she would have laughed until she cried at the image of me sitting at table 11 at my own daughter's wedding eating chicken between a law student and a recently divorced stranger. She would have said, "Roy Decker, you are the most stubborn man I have ever loved." She would have been right. I am stubborn, I am not flashy, I do not own a suit. I have worked with my hands for 40 years, and I have the hands to prove it. And no, I do not blend into every room I walk into, and I have stopped pretending that I should. My daughter is happy. Her husband stood up when it mattered. The project in Fredericksburg is 8 weeks from completion and under budget. I am going back to Beaumont in the spring, to the house I own outright, to the truck I maintain myself, and to a life that is completely sufficient. I am not the help. I never was.